The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Along the thin British line outside Mons in August 1914, a rifleman dropped to one knee as another wave of German infantry advanced across the open ground. There was no time to think. His hands moved almost by instinct. Fire. Bolt. Reload. Fire again. The polished steel bolt swept back and forward in one fluid motion, each movement so practiced that it seemed to disappear between shots. Empty cartridge cases spun into the air, while fresh rounds found the chamber with relentless precision. To the men charging toward them, the volume of fire was almost impossible to believe. Many later assumed they had walked into the killing zone of hidden machine guns. Instead, they had met disciplined riflemen armed with a weapon that seemed capable of bending the limits of human speed. That extraordinary rhythm became the Lee Enfield signature. It was not simply a rifle that fired quickly. It was a rifle that rewarded confidence, repetition, and calm under pressure. In the hands of a trained soldier, it became an extension of muscle memory, allowing accurate, sustained fire even as fear and exhaustion consumed the battlefield. Long before automatic rifles transformed modern warfare, the Lee Enfield gave ordinary infantrymen an ability that felt almost mechanical. It was a weapon built not merely to survive combat, but to dominate it through disciplined skill. Yet the greatest mystery of the Lee Enfield lies beyond that single battlefield. Its origins stretched back to the final years of Queen Victoria's reign, when cavalry still mattered, and the industrial age was only beginning to reshape warfare. Few could have imagined that a rifle conceived in the 1890s would continue fighting through the trenches of the First World War, the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of Burma, the beaches of Normandy, and countless conflicts that followed. Empires rose and collapsed. Tactics evolved. Entire generations of weapons came and went. Still, the Lee Enfield endured. Its reputation eventually gave birth to one of military history's most enduring legends, the Mad Minute, a feat of speed and accuracy so remarkable that it blurred the line between training and myth. But legends are never born by accident. They are forged by necessity, refined through discipline, and proven under fire. So how did one rifle outlive the world that created it? How did a Victorian design become one of the longest-serving military rifles in history, shaping the battlefield across half a century of global conflict? To answer that, we have to return to the crisis that forced an empire to rethink how its soldiers would fight. The story of the Lee Enfield did not begin with a rifle. It began with an empire struggling to keep pace with a changing world. By the closing decades of the 19th century, Britain stood at the center of the largest empire in history, responsible for territories stretching across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Every distant frontier demanded soldiers. Every colonial uprising tested the limits of military endurance. The British Army was expected to project power across continents, often with small expeditionary forces operating thousands of miles from home. In such conditions, a soldier's rifle was more than a weapon. It was the foundation upon which imperial authority rested. For years, the dependable Martini Henry had filled that role. It earned respect in campaigns from southern Africa to Afghanistan, delivering tremendous stopping power and remarkable reliability. But warfare was evolving faster than Britain's military establishment. The Martini Henry was a single-shot rifle in an age that increasingly rewarded sustained fire. Every round demanded a pause to reload, and on battlefields where enemies could appear in waves or exploit every second of hesitation, those pauses became dangerously expensive. Courage alone could no longer compensate for the growing advantage offered by repeating firearms. The search for improvement led Britain toward the Lee Metford rifle, an ambitious step into the era of magazine-fed infantry weapons. It promised faster fire and represented the future the Army knew it needed. Yet history intervened almost as soon as the rifle entered service. Across Europe, smokeless powder was replacing the black powder that had dominated battlefields for generations. It transformed combat by reducing smoke, increasing velocity, and allowing soldiers to fight without immediately revealing their positions. The Lee Metford's barrel rifling, designed for an earlier generation of ammunition, suffered accelerated wear under the hotter, more erosive conditions created by the new propellant. A rifle intended to solve one problem had unexpectedly exposed another. The pressure was not coming solely from Europe. Britain's colonial campaigns repeatedly exposed the harsh reality that modern rifles had to function under conditions far removed from factory testing. Dust, extreme heat, heavy rain, and endless marches punished both men and machines. Soldiers needed a weapon that could endure neglect, deliver rapid and accurate fire, and remain dependable in environments where replacement parts and trained armorers were often weeks away. Each expedition became another reminder that military doctrine meant little if the rifle failed, when lives depended on it. Inside the War Office, the demand for a permanent solution grew impossible to ignore. Britain could no longer afford temporary fixes or short-lived compromises. The Army needed a standardized rifle capable of serving across an empire and against increasingly modern enemies. Fortunately, two separate innovations were already waiting. One offered an exceptionally smooth and efficient bolt-action system. The other promised stronger rifling capable of thriving in the new era of smokeless powder. Individually, each represented progress. Together, they would become something far more significant. Out of mounting pressure, relentless experimentation, and the urgent demands of a changing world, two inventors' ideas were about to converge into one of history's most enduring military rifles. The solution to Britain's rifle crisis did not emerge from a single workshop or a single brilliant mind. It was born from the unlikely convergence of two separate innovations, created by people who never set out to build an imperial icon. One was an inventor determined to rethink how a soldier loaded his rifle. The other was a centuries-old government arsenal devoted to perfecting the barrel through which every bullet would travel. Together, their work would reshape British infantry for generations. James Paris Lee was an unconventional figure in the world of military arms. Born in Scotland and raised in Canada, before later working in the United States, he approached firearms not as a career officer bound by tradition, but as an engineer searching for practical solutions. Watching armies struggle with slow-loading rifles convinced him that the future of infantry combat would depend not simply on more powerful ammunition, but on reducing the time between one accurate shot and the next. His answer was deceptively simple: a smooth operating bolt paired with a detachable box magazine that allowed multiple cartridges to remain ready inside the rifle, instead of forcing soldiers to reload after every shot. What made Lee's design remarkable was not raw mechanical complexity, but efficiency. His rear-locking bolt required relatively little effort to cycle, allowing the rifleman to maintain his firing position while operating the action with practiced speed. The bolt handle traveled in a fluid motion that encouraged rhythm rather than interruption. Competing turn-bolt designs, including those developing across continental Europe, emphasized strength and controlled feeding. Lee pursued something equally valuable, but often overlooked: the ability to keep a trained soldier firing rapidly without sacrificing accuracy. Every fraction of a second saved between shots translated into greater battlefield pressure against an advancing enemy. Yet a brilliant bolt alone could not solve Britain's problems. At the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield, engineers faced another challenge created by the arrival of smokeless powder. The earlier Metford rifling, admired for its accuracy, deteriorated too quickly under the hotter, faster-moving modern ammunition now entering military service. the solution demanded careful experimentation rather than dramatic invention. Enfield engineers developed a stronger rifling pattern capable of enduring prolonged firing while maintaining consistent performance. It was an engineering refinement born from necessity, ensuring that a rifle designed for the future would not wear itself into obsolescence after extended use. Even as these innovations matured, they encountered resistance from within the very institution they were meant to serve. Many senior officers had spent their careers believing disciplined marksmanship depended upon controlled, deliberate fire. To them, magazine-fed rifles appeared dangerously extravagant. Give an infantryman 10 ready rounds, critics warned, and he would simply waste ammunition in moments of panic. Supply officers worried about the impossible burden of feeding such weapons across distant colonial campaigns. Military conservatives feared that rapid fire would encourage recklessness instead of discipline. The debate was never just about machinery. It reflected two competing visions of how wars should be fought. Experience, however, proved more persuasive than theory. Battlefield realities increasingly favored soldiers who could deliver sustained, accurate fire without constantly exposing themselves to reload. The British Army recognized that Lee's efficient action, combined with Enfield's improved barrel, offered precisely the balance it needed. The resulting rifle, officially adopted in 1895 as the Lee Enfield, was more than an updated firearm. It represented a shift in doctrine. Infantrymen were no longer expected merely to conserve ammunition until the decisive moment. They were expected to seize the initiative, dominate firefights through disciplined rapid fire, and impose their will before the enemy could recover. The rifle had finally earned its place in the British Army. But adoption on paper was only the beginning. Turning an innovative design into hundreds of thousands of dependable rifles, each capable of surviving mud, dust, tropical heat, and the hands of ordinary soldiers, would demand an entirely different kind of battle, fought not on distant frontiers, but inside Britain's factories, workshops, and proving grounds. Adopting the Lee Enfield solved Britain's immediate problem on paper, but it created an even greater challenge in practice. A rifle could win trials conducted by experts under controlled conditions. It still had to survive years of hard service in the hands of ordinary soldiers scattered across an empire where deserts, jungles, frozen mountains, and tropical coastlines demanded very different things from the same piece of machinery. That responsibility now fell to the engineers, machinists, inspectors, and factory workers, whose names would rarely appear in history books. Their task was not simply to build rifles, it was to build confidence, one precisely fitted component at a time. Mass-producing a precision bolt-action rifle at imperial scale was an extraordinary undertaking. Every receiver, bolt, barrel, and locking surface had to meet exact tolerances. A bolt that cycled perfectly in a London workshop meant little if dust in South Africa or monsoon rains in India caused it to seize. Inspectors rejected imperfect components by the thousands because a flaw invisible on the factory floor could become fatal on the battlefield. It was an industrial balancing act between craftsmanship and volume, where speed of production could never come at the expense of reliability. The British Army expected every rifle, regardless of where it was issued, to perform with the same consistency. Even as production methods matured, another argument unfolded inside the War Office. It centered on a deceptively simple question: how long should a military rifle be? Tradition insisted that infantry required long rifles for maximum range, while cavalry depended on shorter carbines that were easier to handle on horseback. Maintaining two separate families of weapons, however, complicated manufacturing, training, maintenance, and logistics across a global empire. Every additional model demanded different spare parts, different instruction, and different supply chains. Military planners increasingly wondered whether one rifle could serve both roles without seriously compromising either. The answer emerged in the form of a revolutionary compromise. Introduced in the early 20th century, the short magazine Lee Enfield, better known as the SMLE, abandoned the assumption that longer automatically meant better. Its shorter overall length gave infantry greater agility in trenches, villages, forests, and confined terrain, while remaining practical for mounted troops. More importantly, it simplified the army itself. One standardized rifle could now accompany British soldiers, whether they marched through the Sudan, patrolled the Indian frontier, or prepared for a continental war. It was a logistical decision as much as an engineering one, proving that efficiency behind the front lines could be just as decisive as firepower on it. The rifle's defining characteristics reflected equally deliberate choices. Its 10-round magazine offered more ready ammunition than many contemporary military rifles, reducing interruptions during intense engagements. Combined with Lee's exceptionally smooth bolt action, the design encouraged continuous, controlled fire rather than prolonged pauses between shots. British engineers understood that battles were rarely won by theoretical maximum range alone. More often, victory belonged to the side capable of maintaining pressure when seconds mattered most. The SMLE embodied that philosophy. It was not designed to be the perfect marksman's rifle. It was designed to keep disciplined infantry fighting effectively under relentless battlefield conditions. Yet no weapon reaches its full potential through engineering alone. The British Army built an entire training doctrine around the rifle's strengths, demanding that soldiers master speed without surrendering accuracy. This philosophy reached its most famous expression in the Mad Minute. Riflemen practiced cycling the bolt, reacquiring the target, and firing again with such efficiency that the movements became instinctive rather than conscious decisions. The exercise was never intended to encourage reckless shooting. It rewarded precision under pressure, proving that disciplined rapid fire could overwhelm an advancing enemy long before machine guns dominated every battlefield. The rifle and the soldier became inseparable parts of the same system. Not everyone accepted that philosophy without reservation. Critics argued that emphasizing rapid fire inevitably sacrificed deliberate long-range precision. Across Europe, some military thinkers favored rifles built around stronger actions and greater emphasis on distant marksmanship, believing future wars would reward carefully aimed fire at extended ranges. To them, the Lee Enfield's smooth action and generous magazine reflected an unhealthy obsession with volume. British planners acknowledged those concerns, but judged them against the realities of imperial warfare, where unpredictable engagements often unfolded at practical combat distances rather than textbook ideals. The debate revealed two fundamentally different visions of infantry combat, each preparing for a different kind of war. Meeting the Army's growing appetite for rifles demanded an industrial effort unlike anything Britain had attempted for a service firearm. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield expanded production, while major private manufacturers, such as the Birmingham Small Arms Company and the London Small Arms Company, joined the effort. Together, government arsenals and commercial industry transformed blueprints into hundreds of thousands of rifles through a network of skilled labor, standardized inspection, and increasingly sophisticated manufacturing methods. It was a partnership between state and industry that quietly prepared Britain for a conflict few yet understood was approaching. By the eve of the First World War, the short magazine Lee Enfield represented far more than a successful rifle. It embodied decades of experimentation, compromise, industrial discipline, and military reform. Every lesson learned in workshops, proving grounds, committee rooms, and colonial campaigns had been forged into wood and steel. Soon, all of those decisions would face their ultimate test, not in trials or training fields, but in the opening battles of a war that would change the world forever. When Europe descended into war in August 1914, Britain entered the conflict with an army unlike those of its continental rivals. The British Expeditionary Force was small, numbering only a fraction of the vast conscript armies mobilized by Germany, France, and Russia. It could not hope to match them man for man. Instead, Britain placed its faith in professionalism. These were long-service regulars, shaped by years of rigorous training, colonial campaigns, and relentless marksmanship practice. Every soldier was expected to master his rifle until operating it became instinct. The Lee Enfield was not simply issued to them, became part of their identity, and in the opening weeks of the war, that relationship would surprise an enemy who believed numbers alone would decide the campaign. The first great test came near the Belgian town of Mons. Facing a numerically superior German advance, British infantry occupied defensive positions with little room for error. As enemy formations moved forward, the riflemen waited until the distance closed, then unleashed a storm of disciplined fire. The rhythm was astonishing. A practiced soldier fired, worked the bolt without lifting the rifle from his shoulder, reacquired his target, and fired again. Then again, and again. Across the line, hundreds of rifles repeated the same movement in perfect succession. The battlefield echoed with such relentless intensity that the distinction between individual rifles and automatic weapons seemed to disappear. From that moment emerged one of the most enduring stories of the First World War. German accounts have long been associated with the belief that British troops possessed far more machine guns than they actually did, a perception often linked to the astonishing rate of rifle fire delivered by the British regulars at Mons. Whether every report reflected genuine confusion or whether later retellings amplified the legend remains debated by historians. What is beyond dispute is that the disciplined fire of the British Expeditionary Force shocked the German advance and demonstrated just how devastating well-trained riflemen could be. The famous Mad Minute had moved from rifle ranges to the battlefield, transforming years of practice into deadly reality. For the men carrying the Lee Enfield, its greatest strength was not merely speed, but confidence. Combat rarely unfolded under ideal conditions. Rain turned fields into mud. Dirt found its way into every moving part. Cold, stiffened hands already exhausted by fear and fatigue. Yet the rifle earned a reputation for continuing to function when soldiers needed it most. Its smooth bolt allowed rapid operation even as adrenaline clouded judgment, while its generous magazine reduced the desperate interruptions that accompanied constant reloading. In the confusion of retreat, advance, and desperate defensive action, reliability became more valuable than perfection. A rifle that fired every time offered reassurance in a world where almost nothing else was certain. Even so, the battlefield exposed flaws that peacetime testing could never fully predict. Sustained firing under combat conditions accelerated wear on components. Extraction problems occasionally appeared as rifles endured heavy use, fouling, and damaged ammunition. Bayonet fittings also revealed weaknesses in some circumstances, particularly after prolonged hard service. Armorers worked tirelessly behind the lines, repairing rifles that had survived punishment few engineers could have imagined during development. The Lee Enfield proved remarkably durable, but no mechanical system emerged from industrial warfare entirely untouched by its demands. Across no man's land, German infantry relied primarily on the Mauser rifle, a weapon built around different priorities. Its design emphasized exceptional strength, precision, and deliberate marksmanship at longer ranges. German doctrine reflected those strengths, encouraging carefully aimed fire delivered with discipline and control. The British philosophy, by contrast, emphasized maintaining pressure through rapid, accurate shooting whenever tactical opportunities appeared. Neither approach was inherently superior in every circumstance. Instead, they represented two distinct answers to the same question. How should an infantryman dominate the battlefield? In the mobile engagements of 1914, Britain's emphasis on speed frequently proved devastating. Yet the war itself was already beginning to change. As months passed, sweeping maneuvers gave way to endless trench systems stretching across the Western Front. Open fields disappeared beneath barbed wire, shell craters, and fortified positions. The Lee Enfield adapted because the soldiers carrying it adapted. Long-range volleys became less common than sudden encounters across shattered trenches, communication trenches, and fortified strong points. The rifle remained indispensable, but its role evolved. It became a weapon for close engagements, trench raids, and desperate defensive actions, where speed of handling mattered as much as accuracy. Every lesson learned before the war found new meaning inside the claustrophobic world of trench combat. Behind every discussion of tactics or engineering stood an unbearable human reality. The rifle's remarkable rate of fire was measured not only in rounds fired, but in lives altered forever. British soldiers depended upon that speed to survive assaults that might otherwise have overwhelmed them. German infantry advanced into walls of disciplined fire that inflicted terrible casualties before many reached effective range. Every smooth movement of the bolt represented another young man fighting to remain alive, while another risked never returning home. The Lee Enfield did not create the horrors of the First World War, but it became one of the instruments through which that industrial-scale tragedy unfolded. By the time the fighting settled into a global conflict, stretching far beyond the fields of Belgium and France, the Lee Enfield had already earned a reputation few military rifles ever achieve. It had proven itself not through promises or trials, but under the unforgiving conditions of modern war. And, as the conflict expanded across continents, its story was only beginning. The First World War did more than prove the Lee Enfield in combat. It transformed the rifle into a strategic necessity for an empire fighting on a scale it had never imagined. Every offensive, every defensive line, and every new battalion demanded thousands more rifles than Britain's pre-war factories could produce alone. The conflict was no longer being fought by a professional expeditionary force. It had become an industrial war, where victory depended as much upon production lines as battlefield tactics. To keep pace with mounting losses and expanding armies, the British Empire had to turn the manufacture of the Lee Enfield into a truly global enterprise. Factories across Britain expanded around the clock, while production spread throughout the wider Commonwealth. In Canada, government-supported industry became a vital source of rifles for Allied forces. In Australia, local arsenals strengthened the nation's ability to equip its own troops, despite the immense distance separating it from Britain. India, already one of the empire's most important military recruiting grounds, steadily developed its own manufacturing capability, ensuring that rifles could be repaired and eventually produced closer to the soldiers who depended upon them. This was more than wartime improvisation. It was the creation of an industrial network that bound the empire together through shared production, engineering standards, and military logistics. Those factories produced far more than rifles. They produced skilled machinists, inspectors, engineers, and manufacturing systems that would outlast the war itself. Nations that had once relied almost entirely on British industry began building the technical expertise required to sustain their own armed forces. The Lee Enfield became one of the foundations upon which Commonwealth defense industries matured. In many cases, workshops established to support rifle production later evolved into permanent centers of military manufacturing, influencing generations of weapons development long after the original rifle first entered service. When the guns of the Western Front finally fell silent, the Lee Enfield did not disappear with them. The British Empire still stretched across vast territories, and maintaining that empire demanded soldiers capable of responding to unrest, frontier conflicts, and regional crises. Throughout the interwar years, the rifle remained a familiar companion in policing operations, colonial campaigns, and remote garrisons scattered across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. For countless servicemen, the First World War had ended, but military duty had not. The same rifle that had survived the trenches now accompanied patrols through deserts, mountains, and dense tropical forests, proving once again that reliability often mattered more than novelty. Its reputation also reshaped military thinking beyond Britain's borders. Foreign observers had watched with fascination as British riflemen demonstrated extraordinary rates of accurate fire during the opening battles of 1914. While no army could simply duplicate years of British professional training, many studied the underlying lesson. Disciplined soldiers equipped with efficient rifles could generate battlefield effects far greater than their numbers suggested. Different nations drew different conclusions, but the Lee Enfield had permanently influenced discussions about infantry marksmanship, training standards, and the relationship between individual skill and battlefield firepower. Then, scarcely 2 decades after the First World War ended, the world plunged into another conflict even greater than the last. By the outbreak of the Second World War, military technology had advanced dramatically. Tanks were faster, aircraft dominated the skies, and some armies had begun issuing semi-automatic service rifles. The American M1 Garand represented a new philosophy, allowing soldiers to fire successive shots without manually operating the bolt after each round. Against such innovations, many assumed the Lee Enfield belonged to an earlier era. Yet the rifle refused to become obsolete overnight. British and Commonwealth soldiers carried it from the beaches of Dunkirk to the deserts of North Africa, through the mountains of Italy, the hedgerows of Northwest Europe, and the unforgiving jungles of Burma. In climates that destroyed machinery, and in campaigns where supply lines stretched across oceans, the Lee Enfield continued to earn trust through familiarity, ruggedness, and extraordinary handling. Experienced riflemen could still deliver astonishing volumes of accurate fire, while armorers valued a weapon they understood intimately after decades of service. The rifle was no longer the newest design on the battlefield, but it remained one of the most dependable. Over time, the Lee Enfield became something larger than a military tool. It evolved into a symbol carried by generations of Commonwealth soldiers whose backgrounds, languages, and cultures differed enormously, yet whose experiences were connected by the same rifle slung across their shoulders. It appeared at Gallipoli, where impossible terrain tested endurance as much as courage. It crossed the scorching expanses of North Africa, where wind-driven sand invaded every moving part. It marched through the dense jungles of Burma, where heat, humidity, and disease challenged armies as relentlessly as the enemy. Across these vastly different landscapes, the Lee Enfield became an enduring emblem of shared sacrifice and collective identity. Its global reach was reflected not only in memory, but also in sheer numbers. Produced by factories across Britain and the Commonwealth over decades of continuous service, the Lee Enfield became one of the most widely manufactured bolt-action military rifles in history. Millions were built, repaired, rebuilt, and passed from one generation of soldiers to the next. Few firearms have traveled farther or served longer under so many different flags within a single military tradition. But history rarely allows any weapon to remain unmatched forever. The qualities that had once made the Lee Enfield revolutionary, its smooth bolt, disciplined rapid fire, and exceptional reliability, had been perfectly suited to the wars of its own age. As automatic weapons, semi-automatic rifles, and entirely new doctrines began redefining the modern battlefield, those same strengths would increasingly be measured against a future they had never been designed to face. The Lee Enfield reached its greatest fame at precisely the moment military technology began moving beyond it. For decades, its smooth bolt, generous magazine, and extraordinary rate of aimed fire had given British and Commonwealth infantry a distinctive advantage. But war never stands still. Every battlefield rewards the weapon best suited to its own time, and by the middle of the 20th century, the nature of infantry combat was changing once again. The question was no longer how quickly a soldier could operate a bolt. It was whether he needed to operate one at all. The answer had already begun to emerge before the Second World War ended. Semi-automatic rifles, most notably the American M1 Garand, demonstrated a new approach to infantry firepower. Instead of interrupting every shot to cycle the action manually, soldiers could fire successive rounds as quickly as they could reacquire their targets. In the chaos of close combat, those fractions of a second often meant the difference between seizing the initiative and losing it. As military planners studied the lessons of global warfare, it became increasingly clear that even the fastest bolt-action rifle was approaching the limits of what human hands alone could achieve. Yet history rarely abandons proven weapons overnight. Throughout the Second World War, the Lee Enfield remained the standard rifle for British and Commonwealth forces because it continued to perform the task expected of it. Veterans trusted its reliability. Armorers understood its construction. Factories already possessed the tooling and experience required to produce and repair it in enormous numbers. Replacing a service rifle in the middle of a global conflict was not merely an engineering decision. It involved retraining entire armies, rebuilding industrial capacity, reorganizing logistics, and accepting inevitable disruptions at the worst possible moment. Practical necessity kept the Lee Enfield firmly in frontline service, even as military technology pointed toward a different future. When peace finally returned, the pressure for modernization became impossible to ignore. The emergence of new political alliances transformed military planning as profoundly as technological innovation itself. With the formation of NATO, member nations increasingly sought common standards that would simplify ammunition supply, weapons procurement, and coalition operations. Standardized cartridges promised greater logistical efficiency across Allied armies, reducing the complications that had long accompanied multinational warfare. Britain's trusted rifle, built around an earlier generation of ammunition and doctrine, no longer fit comfortably into that evolving strategic landscape. The search for a successor eventually led to the adoption of the L-Evol-1A1 self-loading rifle, the British adaptation of the Belgian F-NFAL. It represented a fundamentally different philosophy of infantry combat. Self-loading operation reduced the physical demands placed upon the soldier during firefights, allowing faster follow-up shots while preserving accuracy. The transition marked more than the retirement of one rifle. It reflected a broader shift in military thinking, where mobility, sustained firepower, and interoperability with Allied forces increasingly outweighed the virtues that had once defined the Lee Enfield. An era built around disciplined bolt-action marksmanship was giving way to one shaped by modern self-loading weapons. Even so, retirement proved far more gradual than official adoption dates suggest. Across Britain and the Commonwealth, warehouses still contained enormous stocks of serviceable Lee Enfields. Many reserve formations continued training with them long after frontline units had received newer rifles. Police organizations, territorial forces, and local security units also retained the weapon because it remained dependable, familiar, and economical. For governments managing limited defense budgets, replacing every rifle simultaneously was neither practical nor financially realistic. A firearm that continued to function reliably represented value that could not simply be discarded. Political realities reinforced those economic considerations. Newly independent Commonwealth nations often inherited large inventories of Lee Enfields alongside the institutions built to maintain them. Establishing entirely new weapons systems required industrial capacity, foreign procurement agreements, training programs, and financial resources that were not always immediately available. Consequently, many countries continued relying upon the rifle not because it was technologically superior, but because it remained an effective solution within the constraints they faced. Its longevity became as much a story of economics and geopolitics as engineering. That enduring practicality ensured the Lee Enfield continued appearing in conflicts long after many assumed its military career had ended. It served with reserve units, police forces, local militias, and regular armies in different parts of the world, well into the latter half of the 20th century. In remote regions, where reliability outweighed sophistication, the rifle's reputation endured. Decades after its original adoption, soldiers still trusted a design conceived during the Victorian era to perform under harsh conditions, where newer weapons were not always available or sustainable. By then, the Lee Enfield had already outlived the empire that created it, survived 2 world wars, and adapted to generations of changing battlefields. Its withdrawal from frontline service marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of its influence. If anything, retirement allowed history to judge the rifle not merely as a military tool, but as one of the defining firearms of the modern age, a legacy that would continue to grow long after its final shots had been fired in regular service. For most military rifles, retirement marks the end of their story. They disappear into warehouses, museums, or forgotten storage depots, remembered only by specialists and collectors. The Lee Enfield followed a different path. Long after it ceased to be the standard weapon of Britain's armed forces, it continued serving in roles that reflected the remarkable confidence generations of soldiers had placed in it. In some Commonwealth countries, ceremonial units still carry variants of the rifle with the same precision once demanded on the battlefield. Elsewhere, reserve formations and security organizations retained it for years. While in isolated conflicts around the world, aging Lee Enfields occasionally remained in the hands of irregular forces well into the 21st century. Few military firearms have enjoyed such an extraordinary afterlife. That longevity was not the result of nostalgia alone. It was earned through a reputation built under conditions that punished both men and machines. From the mud-filled trenches of the Western Front to the deserts of North Africa, from frozen mountain passes to the humid jungles of Southeast Asia, the Lee Enfield repeatedly demonstrated that reliability could become a strategic advantage. Soldiers learned to trust it because experience had taught them that when exhaustion blurred judgment and the environment threatened to destroy every piece of equipment they carried, the rifle was still likely to function. That confidence became part of its identity, passed from one generation of servicemen to the next through stories as much as through official training. Its influence extended beyond the armies that carried it. Designers of later bolt-action rifles studied the Lee Enfield's exceptional handling and smooth operation, recognizing that a weapon's effectiveness depended not only upon mechanical strength, but also upon the relationship between the rifle and the person using it. The speed with which trained riflemen could cycle its action became a benchmark against which other manually operated military rifles were often measured. Although later generations embraced self-loading and automatic weapons, the Lee Enfield remained a reminder that intelligent ergonomics could dramatically increase battlefield effectiveness without relying solely on greater mechanical complexity. Today, that craftsmanship continues to attract historians, competitive shooters, and collectors who see the rifle as more than an artifact of war. Each surviving example carries the marks of its own journey: inspection stamps from distant arsenals, repairs performed during wartime service, worn wooden stocks shaped by countless hands. To collectors, these details are not imperfections, but evidence of a life lived in extraordinary circumstances. To historians, they reveal the industrial standards, logistical systems, and military priorities of an empire at its height. And to experienced shooters, the rifle still demonstrates why so many veterans remembered its handling with genuine respect decades after leaving military service. Its symbolic importance has become equally enduring. At remembrance ceremonies across the Commonwealth, the Lee Enfield often appears not as a weapon of conflict, but as a link between generations. It represents the millions of ordinary men who carried it through 2 world wars and countless lesser-known campaigns, many of whom never returned home. During commemorations, the rifle stands quietly alongside medals, memorials, and regimental colors, reminding observers that history is preserved not only in monuments, but also in the tools that shaped it. Over time, wood and steel have become vessels of memory. In many ways, the story of the Lee Enfield mirrors the story of the age that produced it. It emerged from the pressures of imperial expansion, matured through industrial innovation, proved itself in the defining conflicts of the 20th century, and gradually yielded to new technologies as warfare evolved. Its success was never the result of a single invention or a single battlefield victory. It reflected the combined efforts of engineers, factory workers, military planners, and countless soldiers whose skill transformed an effective design into a legendary one. Studying the rifle today means studying the evolution of modern infantry warfare itself, how industry, doctrine, and human adaptability combined to shape history. And perhaps that is why the Lee Enfield continues to command such respect. It was never the most powerful rifle of its era, nor the last word in military technology. Instead, it achieved something far rarer. It balanced reliability, speed, practicality, and craftsmanship so effectively that it remained relevant across generations of conflict that its creators could never have imagined. From colonial arsenals and factory workshops to battlefields, museums, and remembrance ceremonies, the Lee Enfield's journey has carried us back to the question that opened this story. How could a rifle designed in the Victorian age survive wars that transformed the modern world? The answer was never found in steel alone. It lived in the people who built it, the soldiers who trusted it, and the history they forged together. The story of the Lee Enfield is, at first glance, the story of a rifle. But by the time its journey comes to an end, it has become something far greater. It begins with an empire searching for answers as warfare entered a new industrial age. It continues through the imagination of inventors, the precision of factory workers, and the determination of military planners willing to challenge old assumptions. It is tested in the smoke of Mons, carried through the trenches of the First World War, across the deserts of North Africa, the cliffs of Gallipoli, the mountains of Italy, and the jungles of Burma. It survives political change, technological revolutions, and the collapse of the empire that first brought it into existence. Few military designs have traveled so far through history while remaining so closely connected to the people who relied upon them. What made the Lee Enfield exceptional was never a single mechanical innovation. It was the way every part of the rifle served the soldier carrying it. The smooth bolt was valuable because it reduced hesitation under fire. The generous magazine mattered because it gave precious seconds back to exhausted infantrymen. Its reliability earned admiration not in workshops, but in freezing rain, choking dust, deep mud, and moments when failure meant death. Its designers understood, whether intentionally or through years of refinement, that the greatest weapon is not always the one with the most impressive specifications. It is the one that works when human beings need it most. That is why the rifle's legacy belongs as much to ordinary soldiers as to engineers. Every scratch worn into its wooden stock, every repaired component, every faded inspection mark tells the story of someone who trusted it through fear, exhaustion, uncertainty, and survival. History often remembers wars through generals, strategies, and political decisions. Yet for the men standing in trenches, crossing rivers under fire, or advancing through shattered villages, history was experienced through the rifle held firmly in their hands. The Lee Enfield became a silent companion to millions whose names never appeared in official reports, but whose lives shaped the course of the 20th century. Perhaps the greatest lesson the Lee Enfield leaves behind is that truly successful designs rarely endure because they are fashionable. They endure because they solve real human problems with remarkable consistency. Technology advances, doctrines change, entire generations of weapons rise and disappear. But when a design is built around the realities of the people who use it, rather than the ambitions of those who create it, its relevance can extend far beyond the era for which it was intended. And so, we return to that battlefield in the opening days of the First World War. A rifleman steadies his breathing. His finger tightens on the trigger. The shot breaks. The bolt sweeps back and forward in one smooth, practiced motion. Another round is chambered. Another moment of history unfolds. More than a century later, the sound of that action has long since faded from the battlefield, but its echo still remains, carried not only in steel and wood, but in the enduring story of innovation, endurance, and the soldiers who made the Lee Enfield legendary.